The snowstorm began suddenly, blanketing the countryside in a suffocating layer of white. May had been prepared for them. Her pantry was stocked, and the fireplace roared with warmth. Her rural home, isolated at the edge of the forest, seemed a cozy retreat. But as the storm howled louder, it brought with it an unease that May couldn't shake. The first morning after the storm, she noticed them, footprints in the snow. They led from the forest to her front door and back again. May frowned, wrapping her coat tighter as she studied the prints. They were deep, as though someone heavy had trudged through the snow in the dead of night. But no one had knocked. No one had called out. Her closest neighbor was 5 miles away, and she hadn't seen anyone in days. She tried to brush it off, thinking maybe a hunter had gotten lost or a passing stranger sought shelter. But when the footprints appeared again the next morning, the pit in her stomach grew heavier. This time, they circled her house, as though someone had been watching from every window. By the third morning, May couldn't ignore it. The footprints were accompanied by something new, strange, jagged scratches on the wooden frame of her front door, like claw marks etched deep to the wood. Her breath hitched as she traced the grooves with trembling fingers. She tried calling the police, but the storm had knocked out her phone line, and her cell signal was non-existent. Even her internet connection had given up days ago. That night, May double-checked all the locks. She dragged an old chair in front of the door and placed a heavy iron skillet on the table beside her bed. She kept the fireplace going, unwilling to let the darkness creep in. But even the warm glow of the flames couldn't banish the chill she felt. A noise woke her just past midnight, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from the living room. May sat up, clutching the skillet. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. Slowly, she crept down the hallway, her breath shallow. The tapping stopped as she reached the living room, plunging the space into an eerie silence. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of something pressed against the glass was unmistakable. A face, pale and blurry, as though the frost on the window was distorting it. May froze, her grip tightening on the skillet. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, as if sensing her presence, the face tilted unnaturally, its lips curling into a smile. May stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The noise seemed to snap her out of her paralysis, and she ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. For hours, she sat trembling in her bed, clutching the skillet like a lifeline. When morning came, she cautiously ventured out. The window was empty, the frost undisturbed. But outside, the footprints returned. They circled the house again, only this time, they didn't leave. They ended at her bedroom window. May's nerves were fraying. She spent the day blocking windows with blankets and pushing furniture against the doors. She tried the radio for news or emergency updates, but the static was relentless. Night came too quickly, swallowing her fragile sense of security. She refused to sleep, keeping watch by the fireplace with skillet in her lap. At 2 a.m., she heard the knocking. It wasn't faint or hesitant like before. It was loud, demanding, a rhythmic pounding that echoed through the house. May stayed frozen, her eyes darting between the windows and the door. Then, the sound stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of scratching, coming from every direction, walls, windows, even the ceiling. And then it came, a voice, soft and distorted, whispering her name. May, let me in. She clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, but the voice grew louder, closer. Her name reverberated in her skull, each syllable dripping with malice. When she opened her eyes, the fire had gone out, leaving her in suffocating darkness. The whisper stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak, the sound of a door opening. May's heart stopped. She knew she'd locked everything. She'd checked twice, 3 times. But now, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway, closer and closer. The skillet slipped from her hands, and she crawled back into the corner, tears streaming down her face. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. The knob rattled once, then twice. May pressed her back against the wall, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The door opened, but nothing stood there. The hallway was empty, but May couldn't bring herself to move. Slowly, frost began creeping across the walls, spreading like veins. Her breath came out in visible puffs as the temperature plummeted. Then she saw it, her own reflection in the frost-covered mirror. But it wasn't her. The face staring back at her smiled, lips curling unnaturally wide. Before May could scream, the frost enveloped her, freezing her mid-breath. When the police arrived days later, they found her home undisturbed. The windows were intact, the doors locked from the inside, and May was sitting in her chair by the fireplace, her face frozen in a mask of terror, as though she'd been caught mid-scream. The abandoned asylum stood like a hulking specter on the snow-drenched hill, its broken windows glaring out into the icy night. Ethan had always been drawn to places like this, Forgotten ruins steeped in history and shadow. As a journalist specializing in the macabre, he'd chased plenty of ghost stories. But this one was different. Locals called it the Winter Asylum, a place where the heating failed decades ago, causing the patients and staff to freeze to death overnight. Rumors claimed their spirits still lingered, trapped in the perpetual cold. Ethan's boots crunched through the snow as he approached the asylum gates. The iron bars were twisted, their once proud facade now marred by rust and ice. His flashlight beam illuminated a faded sign hanging precariously, Lakeview Psychiatric Hospital. He recorded a brief voice memo, his breath visible in the frigid air. Arrived at Lakeview, snowstorm rolling in, going inside. The front doors groaned as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the vast, empty halls. The air was bitterly cold, colder than it had been outside. Frost clung to the walls, and the faint smell of mildew and rot lingered beneath the icy chill. Ethan adjusted his camera, the red light blinking steadily as he filmed his surroundings. The entryway was a time capsule from the 1960s. A reception desk stood covered in a thick layer of dust, and old patient files lay scattered across the floor. He picked one up, the name barely legible. Patient number 42, Martin Keller. Diagnosis, severe paranoia. The file was brittle, the edges crumbling at his touch. Lakeview was shut down in 1963 after a catastrophic failure of its heating system, Ethan narrated, his voice steady, despite the unnerving stillness around him. Everyone inside froze to death. The bodies weren't discovered until weeks later, perfectly preserved in the cold. As he ventured deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop even further. His breath fogged the air, and his fingers numbed despite the gloves. The hallways stretched endlessly, each turn revealing more decay. Wheelchairs sat abandoned, their metal frames covered in frost. Doors hung open, revealing empty patient rooms with peeling wallpaper and rusted bed frames. Then he heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. Ethan stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed only shadows. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing back to him. The giggle came again, this time from behind him. Ethan spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The hallway was empty, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, but he knew better. His instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. He pressed on, his nerves taut. In one of the patient rooms, he found a wall covered in scratches. They looked like claw marks, as though someone or something had been desperately trying to escape. Scrawled across the wall in jagged letters were the words, "The cold keeps them here." Ethan's flashlight flickered. He smacked it with his palm, and the beam steadied, but the sense of unease deepened. He reached the main wing of the asylum, where he discovered a door marked Records Room. Inside, file cabinets lined the walls, their drawers hanging open. In the center of the room was a large, frost-covered logbook. Ethan flipped it open, his fingers trembling as he scanned the pages. The entries were chilling. December 18th, 1962. Patient number 17 reports seeing figures in the snow outside her window. Claims they whisper to her at night. January 5th, 1963. Staff experiencing unexplained cold spots. Heating system under review. January 15th, 1963. Emergency situation. Patients and staff exhibiting signs of hypothermia despite functional heating. Something is wrong. The final entry sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. January 16th, 1963. They've come for us. The cold is alive. We can't escape. A sudden bang made him drop the logbook. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating the now empty doorway. The sound of footsteps echoed once more, this time faster, heavier, coming straight toward him. He backed up against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the footsteps stopped. A shadow loomed in the hallway, long and distorted. Ethan's flashlight flickered again, plunging him into darkness. When it came back on, the shadow was gone, but the frost on the walls had spread, creeping toward him like a living thing. "Get it together," he whispered, forcing himself to move. He exited the records room and headed toward the main staircase, desperate to leave. But as he reached the second floor, he heard something new. Whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. They called his name, drawing it out like a sinister lullaby. "Ethan!" Panicked, he broke into a run, the whispers growing louder. He stumbled into a large room and froze. It was the common area, and it was filled with frost-covered figures. They stood motionless, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. Ethan approached one, his breath hitching. It was a nurse, her eyes wide and unseeing, icicles hanging from her fingertip. Suddenly, the room grew darker, the frost spreading faster. Ethan felt a bone-deep cold, like something was pulling the warmth from his body. The whispers grew deafening, and the figures began to move. Their heads turned toward him in unison, their mouths opening in silent screams. Ethan bolted, his camera swinging wildly. The stairs were just ahead, but the frost was there too, coating the banister, making it slick. He slipped, falling hard on his back. As he struggled to stand, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a tattered hospital gown, his skin pale and translucent, frost clinging to his lips. "Stay," the man rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The cold keeps us safe." Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. He burst through the front doors, the snowstorm nearly blinding him as he sprinted to his car. He fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The asylum loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly, as though dozens of eyes watched him leave. When Ethan reviewed his footage later, the whispers were audible, clear as day, and in the final frame, as he exited the asylum, a figure stood in the doorway, watching him with frostbitten eyes. The wind howled across the icy plains as Lara maneuvered her car along the lonely stretch of highway. The snowstorm had been relentless, reducing visibility to almost nothing. She glanced at the dashboard clock. 10:42 p.m. She was still miles away from her destination, a cabin she had rented for a weekend getaway to escape the stress of her life in the city. Her headlights barely pierced the swirling snow, and the only sign of civilization was the faint glow of a gas station up ahead. Lara sighed with relief, pulling into the lot. The station looked old, its paint peeling and windows fogged. She stepped out, pulling her coat tight against the freezing wind, and headed inside. The clerk was an older man with sunken eyes and a worn flannel shirt. He barely glanced up as she entered. "Storm's bad tonight," he muttered. "Shouldn't be driving in it." "I know," Lara replied, forcing a smile. "Just need to fill up and grab some coffee." As she poured herself a cup of stale, lukewarm coffee, she noticed a bulletin board on the far wall. It was covered in faded photographs and yellowed papers. Missing persons flyers dominated the space, each one marked with the same ominous stamp. "Last seen on Route 47. Lara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What's with all the missing person flyers?" she asked the clerk, her voice wavering. He looked up, his expression grim. "People go missing on this road. Happens every winter. Locals say it's cursed." "Cursed?" Lara asked, raising an eyebrow. The clerk hesitated, then leaned in as though sharing a secret. "They say there's something out there in the storm, something that calls to people, lures them off the road. Never found any bodies, just cars abandoned in the snow." Lara forced a laugh, trying to mask her unease. "Sounds like an urban legend." The clerk didn't respond, his gaze fixed on her for a moment too long. "Be careful out there," he finally said. Lara filled her tank and got back on the road, the eerie conversation lingering in her mind. The snowstorm worsened, and the highway seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Her headlights illuminated the swirling flakes, creating a hypnotic effect that made her feel disoriented. Then, she saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man, waving frantically, his body hunched against the cold. Lara's first instinct was to stop, but the clerk's words echoed in her mind. She slowed down, studying the man through her windshield. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin shirt and jeans, his skin pale and frostbitten. Lara hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake, but something about him felt wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though he were struggling to control his limbs. His head turned sharply toward her, and she saw his face. His eyes were hollow pits, black as the void. Panic surged through her, and she hit the gas, speeding past the figure. Her heart pounded as she glanced in the rearview mirror, but the man was gone. Not a trace of him remained on the snowy roadside. The road grew narrower, the storm swallowing her headlight. Lara tried to shake the encounter from her mind, convincing herself it was a trick of the light, her imagination running wild. But a few miles later, she saw another figure, or perhaps the same one. This time, it was a woman. She stood in the middle of the road, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lara slammed on the brakes, her car skidding on the icy pavement. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch, as though she didn't register the vehicle bearing down on her. Lara's car came to a stop just feet away, her breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. The woman's head snapped up, her face pale and featureless, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. Then she took a step forward, her movements eerily fluid, like water flowing uphill. Lara screamed, throwing the car into reverse, but when she looked in her rearview mirror, the road was no longer there. Behind her was a wall of darkness, impenetrable and endless. She had no choice but to go forward. The woman was gone now, the road ahead empty once more, but the sense of being watched pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, as whispers began to fill the car. They were faint at first, like the wind, but they grew louder, distinct words forming in the icy air. "Turn back!" they hissed. "Join us!" "No!" Lara shouted, her voice shaking. She turned the radio on, hoping to drown out the whispers, but static crackled from the speakers, interspersed with faint laughter. Her headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, she was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the road was gone. Her car was surrounded by trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Snow fell heavier now, and her tires crunched over uneven ground. She tried to turn the wheel, but it wouldn't budge, as though something unseen was guiding her. Ahead, a structure loomed, a crumbling wooden house buried in the snow. The whispers grew deafening, urging her toward it. Lara slammed on the brakes, but the car slid forward, stopping just feet from the front porch. The engine died, leaving her in silence. Lara sat frozen, too terrified to move. Then, the whispers returned, this time from inside the car. Her breath fogged the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a face in the mist, her own, but twisted, grinning with malice. A sharp knock on the driver's side window made her scream. She turned, but no one was there. The knock came again, this time from the passenger side. Shadows flitted outside, circling the car. The doors locked and unlocked on their own, the dashboard lights flickering wildly. In her panic, Lara grabbed her phone, desperate for a signal. The screen lit up, displaying a single message: "You can't leave." The car's lights went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The last thing Lara saw was her reflection in the rearview mirror, smiling back at her as icy hands reached around her neck. The frostbitten wind screamed through the dense pines as Noah trudged through the knee-deep snow. The cabin he had rented for a solitary retreat sat nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. A seasoned hiker, Noah had always found peace in the isolation of nature, but this time, something felt off. The oppressive stillness of the forest, broken only by the crunch of his boots, gnawed at his nerves. He finally reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in hues of crimson and orange. It was a modest structure, its wooden exterior weathered but sturdy. Noah dumped his backpack near the door and let himself in, the creak of the hinges echoing in the quiet. Inside, the air was stale, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. He lit a fire in the stone hearth, its glow casting flickering shadows across the room. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a single bed, a small table, and a battered armchair by the fireplace. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck as he unpacked. He chalked it up to exhaustion from the hike and the growing storm outside. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows as if eager to break through. As Noah settled into the armchair with a book, he noticed something peculiar. The firelight danced across the walls, revealing faint etchings carved into the wood. He leaned closer, running his fingers over the grooves. The carvings were old, worn down with time, but still discernible. Symbols, circles, lines, and jagged shapes were etched in chaotic patterns, like a frantic scrawl. His unease deepened as he traced the symbols with his flashlight. They covered the walls, ceiling, even the underside of the table. At the base of one carving, a phrase caught his eye. "They come with the frost." Noah shivered, though the fire blazed warm and bright. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to brush off the growing sense of dread. "Just someone's idea of a prank," he muttered, closing the book and heading to bed. The storm raged through the night, the wind wailing like a wounded animal. Noah struggled to sleep, every creak of the cabin amplified in the oppressive silence. At some point he drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud. His heart pounded as he strained to listen. The sound of his own breathing deafened the stillness. Another thud, louder this time, came from outside. Noah grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. The storm had worsened, snow swirling violently in the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved among the trees. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A figure, tall and gaunt, its movements unnatural, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. Noah froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He scanned the woods again, but the shadow was gone. "It's just the," he whispered, though he didn't believe. He backed away from the window, locking the door and bolting it for good measure. The carvings on the walls seemed to twist in the flickering firelight, the symbols almost alive. The night stretched on, every sound magnified by the storm. At some point, exhaustion took Noah, and he dozed off in the armchair. When he woke, the fire had died, and the cabin was ice cold. His breath misted in the air as he reached for his flashlight. The carvings on the walls were gone. Noah blinked, convinced he was imagining things. He ran his hand over the smooth wood where the symbols had been, but the carvings had vanished without a trace. Panic surged through him as he checked the table. The ceiling, nothing. It was as if they had never been there. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. It was soft, almost polite, but in the stillness of the cabin, it sounded like a gunshot. Noah stared at the door, dread rooting him in place. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, rasping voice. "Let me in." Noah's blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, otherworldly, like a chorus of whispers layered atop one another. He backed away, his flashlight flickering. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The voice came again, closer. "It's cold out here. Let me in." Noah clutched a fire poker from the hearth, his hands trembling. "Go away," he shouted, but the knocking persisted, growing more frantic. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the other side of the door, followed by a scraping sound like claws against wood. Noah's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He scrambled to relight the fire, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the matches. When the flames roared to life, the cabin was empty, but the carvings had returned, etched deeper into the walls than before. The phrase, "They come with the frost," was repeated over and over, spiraling into an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with the firelight. The growling returned, louder now, coming from all around him. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and shift, taking on grotesque shapes. Noah turned, and his breath caught in his throat. A figure stood in the corner of the room, its form obscured by frost and shadow. Its face was featureless, a blank slate of ice, but its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with an eerie, pale light. The air grew colder, frost creeping across the floor toward him. "No," Noah whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." The figure tilted its head, as if studying him. Then it spoke, its voice echoing in his mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Noah bolted for the door, but the frost had spread, sealing it shut. The windows were frozen solid, trapping him inside. The fire flickered weakly, the warmth being sucked from the room. The last thing Noah saw before the light extinguished entirely was the figure lunging toward him, its frost-bitten hands outstretched. Days later, a search party found the cabin buried under several feet of snow. The door was locked from the inside, and the windows were intact. Noah's belongings were still there, his backpack neatly packed. But of Noah himself, there was no sign, only the faint scent of frost lingering in the air. The train station was desolate, a forgotten relic of the past, buried in a thick blanket of snow. Maddie hugged her coat tighter around her as the wind bit at her cheeks, the icy air cutting through even the thickest layers. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere after her connecting train had been canceled due to a sudden snowstorm. The only other passengers had left hours ago, opting to brave the elements rather than wait for the next train, which was still hours away. The station itself was eerily quiet. A dim light flickered above the ticket counter, casting long shadows across the cracked tiles. The old benches creaked with the weight of time, their wood worn smooth by countless travelers who had passed through this forgotten place. Maddie checked her phone for the 100th time, but there was still no signal. She sighed and looked around the station, her unease growing. There was something unsettling about the stillness, as though the place were holding its breath. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down her spine. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was stuck at 2:13, its hands frozen in place. Maddie decided to explore the station, hoping to distract herself from the oppressive silence. She wandered down a dimly lit corridor, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallway led to a series of locked doors, their paint peeling and rust streaking the hinges. At the end of the hall, she found an old waiting room, its glass doors etched with frost. The room was colder than the rest of it, and Maddie's breath fogged in the air as she stepped inside. A single bench sat in the center of the room, and next to it was a suitcase, covered in a thin layer of dust. She hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone else was there, but the room was empty. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the suitcase. It was old, its leather cracked and the brass latches tarnished. Maddie knelt down and wiped away the dust, revealing a name tag attached to the handle. The name was faded, but she could just make out the initials, E.H. A sudden noise made her jump, a faint tapping like fingers drumming on glass. Maddie spun around, her heart racing. The room was empty, but the frost on the windows had thickened, obscuring the view outside. She stepped closer to the glass, peering through the icy patterns. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing on the platform, shrouded in shadow. But when she blinked, it was gone. The tapping came again, louder this time. Maddie's breath hitched as she realized it was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the room. The suitcase was gone. A chill ran down her spine, and she backed toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She froze when she saw it. The suitcase was now on the bench, its latches undone and the lid slightly ajar. Maddie's mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Had she imagined the suitcase on the floor? Had someone moved it while she wasn't looking? She approached the bench cautiously, her hands trembling. The suitcase seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and a faint sound emanated from within, like distant whispers carried on the wind. Maddie hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but something compelled her to open it. The lid creaked as she lifted it, and a gust of icy air escaped, extinguishing the faint light in the room. Inside the suitcase was a single object, an old photograph. Maddie picked it up, her fingers numb from the cold. The image was black and white, depicting a group of people standing on the very platform she had just been on. Her stomach dropped when she recognized one of the faces. It was her own. Maddie's hands shook as she stared at the photo. The version of herself in the picture was smiling, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that didn't belong to her. Behind her, the station looked new, bustling with life. The other people in the photo were strangers, their faces pale, expressionless. A low, guttural sound filled the room, and Maddie dropped the photo, backing away. The suitcase slammed shut on its own, the latches clicking into place. The frost on the windows crept inward, spreading across the walls and floor. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Maddie ran, her boots slipping on the icy floor as she fled the waiting room. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, the light flickering ominous. She reached the main hall, only to find it transformed. The benches were gone, replaced by rows of empty chairs. The clock on the wall now ticked, its hands spinning wildly. She tried the door to the platform, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping returned, more insistent, and Maddie turned to see the suitcase sitting in the middle of the room. The whispers returned, louder now, forming words that sent chills down her spine. "Join us." The door slammed shut, the lights extinguished, and the room plunged into darkness. Maddie's screams echoed through the station, but no one was there to hear them. The next morning, the station was silent once more. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the platform blanketed in white. A lone traveler arrived, waiting for the first train of the day. They noticed a dusty old suitcase sitting on the bench, its latches undone. The initials EH were etched into the handle, and beside it lay a photograph of a group of people standing on the platform. Among them was a woman who looked eerily familiar, a face frozen in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a winding path of black asphalt cutting through the frozen wilderness. Laura tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she navigated the treacherous conditions. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, and her headlights struggled to pierce the gloom. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. She had hoped to make it to her family's cabin hours ago, but the storm had other plans. Her phone buzzed in the passenger, and she glanced over. It was a text from her mother, asking if she had arrived yet. Laura typed a quick reply at the next stop sign, assuring her mom she was fine and only about 30 minutes away. As she set the phone down, something darted across the road, a blur of motion in the darkness. She slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded on the icy road, coming to a halt just short of the tree line. Breathing heavily, Laura scanned the area, but there was nothing. Just the snow swirling in the beam of her headlights. She shook her head, convincing herself it was a deer or maybe a fox. Still, the feeling of unease settled in her chest, heavy and cold. She put the car in drive and continued, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that lined the road. After about 10 minutes, the faint glow of a gas station appeared in the distance. Relieved, Laura decided to stop and stretch her legs. The gas station looked old, its neon sign flickering weakly. She pulled up to the pump, noting the eerie stillness around her. Inside, the place was empty except for the attendant, an older man with a lined face and tired eyes. He looked up from his magazine as she entered, giving her a small nod. Laura smiled awkwardly and grabbed a coffee. The warmth seeped into her hands, a welcome comfort against the biting cold. "You shouldn't be out on a night like this," the attendant said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm just passing through," Laura replied, sipping the bitter coffee. The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Be careful on this road. Folks around here say strange things happen after midnight." Laura chuckled nervously. "Thanks for the warning. I'll be careful." The man didn't respond, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. She paid for her coffee and left, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked out the door. The interaction left her unsettled, but she shook it off. Small-town folk were always a little quirky, she told herself. Back on the road, the storm seemed to intensify. The snow fell harder, and the wind howled like a living thing. Laura's nerves were on edge, every shadow and movement catching her attention. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. She slowed the car, squinting to make out the details. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned coat that billowed in the wind. His head was bowed and his hands were clasped in front of him in prayer. Laura honked the horn, but he didn't move. Her stomach tightened as she approached. Something about the figure felt wrong. His stillness was unnerving, almost unnatural. She rolled down the window slightly, shouting over the window, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. Laura's pulse quickened as she considered her option. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't bring herself to drive past him either. She reached for her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Suddenly, the man raised his head and Laura's breath caught in her throat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes glowed, a pale, eerie light that seemed to pierce through her. He tilted his head, his movements jerky and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through her, and she threw the car into reverse, backing away as quickly as she could. The man didn't move, but his gaze followed her, unblinking. When she finally put enough distance between them, she turned the car around and sped back the way she had come. The gas station reappeared like a beacon in the storm, and Laura pulled in, her heart pounding. She rushed inside, startling the attendant. "Did you see him?" she gasped. "The man on the road?" The attendant's expression darkened. "What man?" Laura described the figure, her voice trembling. The old man's face grew pale, and he shook his head. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "Get back in your car, and don't stop for anyone." "What's going on?" Laura demanded, but the man refused to answer. He shoved a map into her hands, circling an alternate route. "Take this road, and whatever you do, don't look back." Confused and terrified, Laura had no choice but to comply. She thanked the man and hurried back to her car. As she drove away, the storm seemed to ease, the snow falling lighter and the wind dying down. The alternate route took her through a dense forest, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. For a while, the drive was uneventful, and Laura began to calm down. But then she noticed something in her rearview mirror. A light, faint at first, but growing steadily brighter. It was a pair of headlights, approaching fast. Relief flooded her. Maybe it was another car, someone else trying to navigate this cursed road. But as the vehicle drew closer, she realized it wasn't a car. It was a single pale light, casting long, twisted shadows across the road. The light drew closer, impossibly fast, and Laura's car sputtered as if the engine were dying. Panic surged as she pressed the gas pedal, but the car refused to accelerate. The light engulfed her, flooding the interior of the car with an icy glow. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. The car roared back to life, and Laura slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. She sat there shaking, trying to catch her breath. When she looked in the rearview mirror again, the light was gone. But in its place, she saw something else, her own reflection, staring back at her with glowing, pale eyes. Laura's scream echoed through the empty forest, swallowed by the cold, endless night. The winter night was unforgiving, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you. Sam trudged through the snow-covered forest, clutching his flashlight tightly. He had taken this shortcut dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The storm had knocked out the main road, forcing him to cut through the woods to reach his cabin. The moon hung low, its light filtering through the skeletal branches overhead, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Sam's breath puffed out in white clouds, the only sound breaking the silence, aside from the crunch of snow under his boots. The path ahead was faint, obscured by fresh snowfall, but he pressed on, eager to get home before the weather worsened. As he rounded a bend, Sam stopped abruptly. In the middle of the trail was a small wooden sign he had never seen before. The wood was old, weathered, and splintered, with crude letters carved into its surface. "Keep out!" Sam frowned. This was public land. No one had any right to put up a sign like this. He glanced around, but the forest was empty, the silence oppressive. Ignoring the warning, he stepped over the sign and continued on his way. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and carrying with it a faint sound. At first, Sam thought it was the wind, but as he listened more closely, he realized it was humming, a low, melodic tune, almost like a lullaby. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting on the icy air. "Hello," Sam called out, his voice echoing through the woods. The humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. He swallowed hard, his unease growing, but he forced himself to keep walking. The faster he got home, the sooner he could forget this strange encounter. The trail grew narrower, the trees closing in on either side. Sam's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light ahead of him. He smacked it against his hand, but the beam continued to waver. That's when he noticed it, a figure standing just off the path. It was a woman, dressed in a thin white dress that billowed in the wind. Her long hair hung in dark, damp strands that obscured her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening for. Sam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. The wind howled around them, and Sam took a hesitant step closer. "Do you need help?" The woman slowly raised her head, and Sam's breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to look straight through him. Her lips parted, and she let out a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. Sam stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for it, his fingers trembling, and when he managed to switch it back on, the woman was gone. His pulse raced as he scanned the woods, the beam of his flashlight darting from tree to tree. The humming returned, louder now, surrounding him like a swarm of angry bees. Panic clawed at his throat as he turned and ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees stretching taller and their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The trail he had been following was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of snow. Sam's lungs burned as he ran, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He stopped suddenly, his legs trembling beneath him. The humming had stopped. The silence was suffocating. He turned slowly, his flashlight casting long shadows across the snow. Behind him, the woman stood once more, closer this time, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth stretched into a twisted smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Sam stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root, and he fell hard onto the ground. The woman moved toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, her feet leaving no prints in the snow. "Please," Sam begged, his voice barely a whisper. "Leave me alone." The woman crouched down in front of him, her face inches from his. Her breath was cold, freezing the air between them. She reached out a hand, her fingers impossibly long and claw-like, and traced a line down his cheek. "You ignored the sign," she said, her voice a haunting whisper that echoed in his mind. Before Sam could react, she opened her mouth, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. When the search party found Sam the next day, he was lying in the snow, his body frozen but his face contorted in a mask of pure terror. Clutched in his hand was a small wooden sign, the words "Keep Out," etched deeply into its surface. No one could explain how it had gotten there, or why there were no footprints leading to or from his body. The locals whispered about the forest, about the woman who haunted its trails, luring the unwary to their doom. And though no one dared venture there after dark, the humming could still be heard on cold, windy nights, drifting through the trees like a ghostly warning. The icy wind tore through the empty streets of the small mountain town, carrying with it the sound of rattling windows and the occasional hollow whistle. Emma pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she made her way down the snow-covered path, the crunch of her boots, the only sound in the stillness. She had always loved the quiet of winter nights, but tonight felt different, oppressive, as if the silence were waiting for something. She had been staying at her aunt's house for the past week, helping her recover from surgery. The house sat on the edge of the forest, surrounded by tall pines that swayed ominously in the wind. Emma had gone into town to grab some groceries, but the late hour and worsening storm had delayed her return. Now, with the streets deserted and the sky darkened by storm clouds, she regretted not leaving sooner. Her car was parked just around the corner. She turned onto the side street, pausing as she spotted something unusual. A figure stood by her car, partially obscured by the swirling snow. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned coat and hat. His back was to her, but he was unnervingly still, as if he were frozen in place. Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn around. But logic took over. It was probably just a local trying to shield himself from the storm. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding. "Excuse me?" she called, her voice breaking the silence. The man didn't respond. He remained as still as a statue, his head slightly tilted toward the car. Emma took a step closer, gripping the pepper spray in her pocket, just in case. "Sir, are you okay?" She tried again. The figure moved suddenly, turning his head to look at her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. His face was pale, almost luminescent, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His mouth curved into a smile, too wide, too sharp, and Emma took an involuntary step back. Without a word, the man turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to get in the car and leave, but a part of her was terrified he might be waiting for her in the woods. After several moments of tense silence, she forced herself to move. She unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind her. As she started the engine, her headlights illuminated the road ahead and the same man, now standing directly in front of the car. Emma gasped, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The man's glowing eyes locked onto hers, his smile growing wider. She floored the gas pedal, her tires spinning on the icy road before finding traction. The man didn't move as she sped toward him, but as the car passed through the spot where he had been standing, he was gone. Emma didn't stop driving until she reached her aunt's house. She parked in the driveway and ran inside, locking the door behind her. Her aunt was asleep in her bedroom, the house eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. Trying to shake off the encounter, Emma turned on every light in the house and made herself a cup of tea. She settled onto the couch, but her unease wouldn't fade. She kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at her. As the clock struck midnight, a sound broke the silence, the faint crunch of footsteps outside. Emma froze, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, circling the house. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. "There's someone outside," she whispered to the operator, her voice shaking. "I think he's trying to get in." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but the footsteps stopped abruptly. Emma held her breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her heart. A moment later, the doorknob rattled. Emma stifled a scream, backing away from the door. The rattling stopped, replaced by a loud knock that echoed through the house. "Emma!" A voice called, soft and chilling. "Let me in." She clamped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The voice was distorted, inhuman, yet somehow familiar. It called her name again, more insistently this time. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Emma's phone slipped from her hands as the sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen. She ran upstairs, locking herself in her aunt's bedroom. Her aunt stirred awake, confused and groggy. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. "There's someone in the house," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs, slow and deliberate. Emma grabbed a lamp, ready to defend herself, but the footsteps stopped just outside the door. The doorknob turned slowly, and a soft voice spoke again. "Emma, why won't you let me in?" The door shook violently, and Emma screamed as the hinges began to give way. Just as the door burst open, the sound of sirens filled the air, and bright lights flooded the house. The intruder was gone. The police found no signs of forced entry beyond the broken window, and there were no footprints in the snow outside. The officers assured Emma and her aunt that the storm must have obscured any evidence, but Emma knew better. That night, as she lay awake, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with glowing eyes and a chilling voice that whispered her name. The cold air in the small town of Frostwood had always been thick and biting, especially at night. Winter brought a certain kind of stillness to the place, as if the entire town was waiting for something to happen. But for Jenny, it had always felt safe. A quiet, sleepy town where she could escape from the noise of the city. She had moved here for a fresh start, renting a small cabin on the outskirts of town. The house was nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional cry of an owl. That night, however, something felt off. Jenny had just returned from a late-night walk through the snow-covered woods, the quiet broken only by the crunch of her boots in the snow. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. The cold wind had picked up, whipping the trees into eerie shapes, their branches groaning under the pressure of the storm. She had been out there longer than planned, but it wasn't until she reached the edge of the woods that she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her back. As she walked back toward the cabin, she could have sworn she saw a figure moving between the trees, just out of the corner of her eye. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but then it happened again. Someone or something moving between the shadows. Her heart raced as she quickened her pace. The house seemed miles away, the dark trees surrounding her like watching eyes. Jenny turned to glance over her shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty expanse of snow. She made it back inside, locking the door behind her. The fire crackled in the hearth, but despite the warmth, a chill lingered in the air. She tried to shake it off, blaming her imagination, but something wasn't right. The night passed uneventfully, and the next day, she set out to work on some writing, hoping to distract herself from the lingering dread. As the hours passed, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards seemed amplified, and every shadow cast by the setting sun seemed to stretch unnaturally. She couldn't help but glance nervously over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Jenny heard it, a faint, hollow knocking at the door. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it persisted. Knock, knock, knock. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved toward the door cautiously. There was no one in sight, just the snow falling in soft, swirling flakes. She stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But then, the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. Her heart raced. Was it just someone playing a cruel prank? Or was there something else out there? Something that had been watching her for days? Jenny backed away slowly from the door. She knew she needed to check the perimeter of the house, make sure everything was secure. but a voice in her head told her not to go outside, to stay away from the darkness. It was too late to call the police. Frostwood was too far removed from the nearest town, and even if she did, who would believe her? The knocking continued, relentless, shaking her to the core. With trembling hands, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the front door just enough to peer out. The cold air hit her face like a slap, but the sight that greeted her was even worse. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, its face obscured by the hood of a long, dark cloak. The person, or whatever it was completely still, their body shrouded in shadow, the faintest hint of movement in the wind making their cloaks sway gently. Jenny could barely make out any features, just the hollow space where their face should have been. "Who's there?" Jenny called, her voice shaky but firm. No answer came. She stepped out onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The figure didn't move, their gaze fixed on her in the shadows. "Are you lost?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. "Do you need help?" But as soon as the words left her mouth, the figure started to move toward her, slowly, methodically. With every step it took, the air grew colder, the silence more suffocating. Jenny's grip on the flashlight tightened as she backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. She turned to run back inside, but as she reached for the door, the figure spoke. "Jenny!" Her blood ran cold. The voice was deep and hollow, like it came from the depths of an ancient grave. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure's face came into view, but it was wrong. Empty, like a mask, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. The smile that formed on its face wasn't a smile at all, but a grotesque, twisted thing that stretched unnaturally wide. "Jenny!" it repeated, its voice like the wind scraping against stone. "I've been waiting for it." Panic surged through her, and she grabbed the door handle, yanking it open and slamming it shut behind her. She bolted the locks, breathing heavily, her hands shaking uncontrollably. For the next few hours, Jenny huddled by the fire, too terrified to sleep. She heard faint scratching sounds at the door and the windows. Just the wind, she told herself. But it didn't feel like the wind. It felt like something was trying to get in. The knocking continued at random intervals, but it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the windows, the walls, everywhere. And then, just before dawn, she heard it again. Soft, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. A whisper. "Jenny." Jenny's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door, but the figure wasn't there anymore. The house was silent, eerily still, but the lingering sense of dread wouldn't leave her. The next morning, she packed her bags and left the cabin, not daring to look back. No matter how far she drove, no matter how fast she went, she could feel the weight of those hollow eyes on her, watching from the shadows, and she knew, deep down, that whatever had been waiting for her in Frostwood had no intention of letting her go. It would follow her, always, just out of sight.